Sí, gracias. Bueno, buenas tardes, bienvenidos a esta sesión de nuestro Seminario de Investigadores. Bueno, en primer lugar, agradecerles por estar aquí y agradecerle a Addison Ellis su participación. Es un becario postdoctoral en nuestro instituto. Y bueno, si te parece bien, Addison, comenzamos. Tienen ahí el handout y Addison va a dar su plática en inglés. Adelante.
Muchas gracias a todos. Gracias por venir. Um, Today, what follows is essentially a set of notes for thinking anew about Kant's claim that we cannot know things as they are in themselves. Uh, I've I've realized only recently that my conclusions here are ultimately, I think, aimed at an understanding of Kant that both brings into focus a crucial insight of Sebastian Rödel's and questions its supposed Hegelian destiny. That's a bigger topic than I can address here, but that insight is that knowledge in its self conscious activity is something, an understanding of which is absolutely basic and fundamental to any other form of understanding, and contains within itself a conception of its objectivity. Um, the error, I believe, would be to not have a corresponding account of Kant's claim that we know nothing of things as they are in themselves, or Noumena. Um, so there's surely much room here for clarity and precision in what follows, but I hope that it will show itself to be a worthwhile introduction to a project for thinking about this issue in a fresh way. So one of the most heavily discussed and complex aspects of Kant's transcendental idealism is his claim that we have no knowledge of things as they are in themselves, but only of appearances. This should be familiar to many. An essential part of this discussion is the question of what his conception of things in themselves is in the first place. Some hold that things in themselves are metaphysically real things understood as possessing only intrinsic, non relational properties. Ray Langdon, for instance, wrote a book about this. She also wrote a paper in which she brings David Lewis into this discussion, which is interesting for those who work in that area. Others hold that things in themselves are not metaphysically posited by Kant at all, at least in Kant's mature philosophy, but serve only as a kind of limiting concept for the understanding, the faculty of knowledge. Indeed, changes from the A to the B edition of the first critique have led some to believe that Kant either changed his own views about things in themselves or else significantly clarified them in the intervening years. And finally, there's a question of what the relation is between Kant's concept of the thing in itself and the concept of a noumenon. Kant himself has only a few cryptic remarks about this relation, but there's clearly an overlap between these concepts, such that the thing in itself and the noumenon both refer to the object as it would be known by an infinite or intuitive intellect. Things in themselves, Kant says, would be objects that do not conform to our subjective spatiotemporal sensible conditions, and thus objects that are independent of such sensible conditions. These are the objects of knowledge for, say, the classical rationalist or the empiricist. And at the same time, things in themselves are conceived of positively as the objects that would be known by an intellect which is not saddled with such subjective sensible conditions, that is, an intuitive or infinite intellect, God's divine intellect. The negative conception of things in themselves corresponds to what Kant calls the noumenon in the negative sense, while the positive conception corresponds to the noumenon in the positive sense. And noumenon here is, in the original Greek, a being of the understanding, which is to say that it is a being the knowledge of which is had in and through understanding alone, independently of sensibility. In fact, in Kant's personal notes from his copy of the first edition of the First Critique, he writes, and by the way, there's a handout with quotes. You can follow along. I'll signal which quote I'm going to read so that you can read along. This is quote number 1. Kant wrote in his personal copy of the First Critique, "Noumena, beings that themselves have understanding, also causality with regard to the objects of their understanding through the understanding itself, that is, will and then all other categories, that is, pure intelligences. But since we take all sensible conditions from them, we cannot think them determinately. The possibility of something like that is not clear." So I first want to note that this suggests that noumena not only would be intelligible through the understanding alone, but also have their being through understanding. The noumenon would be an object brought about through understanding, and so absolutely inseparable from understanding as an activity. And it may be worth pointing out here that noumena are both absolutely internal to the understanding and absolutely independent of human sensibility, that is, the conditions under which we receive objects in perception. Some, I think, only notice the second point and think of noumena or things in themselves as entirely outside the sphere of our cognition, simplicator. But the fact of the matter, I think, is more complex and interesting than this. Now, assuming that, for our present purposes, that thing in itself and noumenon are roughly equivalent terms, though they're not identical, to be sure. So things in themselves, we can come back to this in the Q&A. Things in themselves belongs to the pair appearances and things in themselves, while noumena belongs to the pair phenomena and noumena, right? And Kant calls appearances the undetermined objects of empirical intuition, perception. And likewise, I think considers the thing in itself as something undetermined, or something which we think in a quite indeterminate way. Whereas the idea of the noumenon is the idea of an object as it is actually understood through understanding, right? As it is determinately known, something which is, to be sure, completely off limits for our form of cognition. But if we, for now, if we assume that thing in itself and noumenon are roughly equivalent, what does Kant think it means for us to be ignorant of these things? And perhaps more importantly, what does it mean to be ignorant of these things while still retaining an ability to think them, and therefore to think their possibility? And we might begin with Kant's claim that the first step, as he says, for pure reason is dogmatism, the second step skepticism, and then the third step critique. While dogmatism is, he says, the presumption of getting on solely with pure knowledge from philosophical concepts, skepticism would be the censorship of reason, he says. And he famously compares dogmatism and skepticism to the distinction between the rationalists and the empiricists, or uh, Christian Wolff and Leibniz on the one hand, and Hume on the other hand, right? But critique is described, and this is quote number 2 on the handout, is described as, quote, not the censorship, but the critique of pure reason, whereby not merely limits, but rather the determinate boundaries of it, not merely ignorance in one part or another, but ignorance in regard to all possible questions of a certain sort, are not merely suspected, but are proved from principles. Thus, skepticism is a resting place for human reason, which can reflect upon its dogmatic peregrination and make a survey of the region in which it finds itself in order to be able to choose its path in the future with greater certainty. But it is not a dwelling place for permanent residence, for the latter can only be found in a complete certainty, whether it be one of the cognition of the objects themselves or of the boundaries within which all of our cognition of objects is enclosed. So I apologize, by the way, for the length of the quotations, but it can be a bit difficult with Kant to cut these down and maintain their relevance. So we can see then that the noumenal ignorance thesis is a claim to an absolute or radical form of ignorance for Kant. And this is itself interesting for a number of reasons. For one thing, it would seem to distinguish it from ordinary forms of ignorance. Right? I'm ignorant of how many stars there are in our galaxy, but there's nothing in principle preventing me from learning the answer. And there is an answer, right? Even if I'll never know it. For Kant, it's clear that we are, in principle, barred from knowing noumena in some sense. One point that I would like to try bringing out in what follows is that we're barred in principle from knowing noumena because there is a sense in which there's no answer to noumenal questions. And it's not that such questions cannot be asked exactly, and it's not exactly that such answers are simply unavailable to the transcendental philosopher. Rather, the very idea that the questions make contact with the realm of real possibility, or that the answers very well may lie beyond our comprehension, is itself problematic. So I'd like to explore a bit more about what all of this means and why my reading of Kant requires moving past some traditional ways of understanding Kant's noumenal ignorance thesis to begin to see more clearly why this radical form of ignorance is so different from what we may ordinarily mean by ignorance. Consider what ignorance does typically represent. So it would be typical, I think, to contrast learning with a form of ignorance, right? I'm ignorant of how many stars there are in our galaxy, again, right? And then I come to know the answer in due time. But of course, knowing and learning are not equivalent. Maybe that's not an obvious point, but I think it's true. Knowing is not the contrast of ignorance. Right? Aristotle demonstrated, I think, that knowledge is what he calls a pure activity, an energeia, wherein the telos of knowing is not a product brought about after a series of stages. To put it simply, one may know without ever having been ignorant. As Ian Blecker puts it, knowing does not presuppose an opposite state. As it does not presuppose an opposing state, we may say that it is without contrary, in the sense that our concept of knowledge does not, in and of itself, require a conception of a state with which it is contrasted. Now, I just mention as an aside that I borrow the term here "without contrary" from Sebastian Rödel, again, who I mentioned earlier, whose 2018 book is an extended defense of the idea that the science of knowledge, namely logic, is without contrary. But what I'd like to do is begin to suggest that the same is true of our radical noumenal ignorance for Kant. In a sense, it is not ignorance as we ordinarily understand the term, as it doesn't presuppose a determinate opposition with what it would be to overcome this ignorance. So now, one traditional way of approaching Kant's noumenal ignorance thesis is by distinguishing so-called epistemological from metaphysical approaches to transcendental idealism. So while some have understood Kant to mean that things in themselves are real objects which are off limits for our cognition, others have specifically responded to this metaphysical approach by proposing an epistemological reading of Kant, according to which there is really only one properly real object, the appearance, what appears in experience, from which we may abstract the epistemic conditions which constitute it as an appearance and consider it as if it were a thing in itself. Here we can think of readings of Kant given by Henry Allison and Graham Bird, for instance, classical examples. As a contemporary representative of the metaphysical approach, consider Lucy Allais, who says, this quote is not on the handout, by the way, but Lucy Allais says, while transcendental idealism is partly epistemological, it is also partly a metaphysical position, and in specific, a position to the effect that Kant is committed to the claim that the things we cognize have, in addition to the way they appear to us, a nature that is independent of us, which we cannot cognize. Sorry.
It seems that many of us don't have the handout. I don't know whether you can share it.
Yes. Teresa, I believe you're muted.
Está en el chat, Pedro. Está en el chat.
Yes, and I just sent it by mail, like 2 minutes ago.
Oh, okay. Thank you.
Yeah. Okay.
Sorry about that. Yes.
Okay.
Consider also the position held by Desmond Hogan, who says that Kant's mature philosophy holds that there are features of reality which are unknowable in the sense that non-empirical knowledge of these features exceeds our cognitive capacities. So there's a sense in which, even if these metaphysical readings do not consider Kant to be a general skeptic, as it were, about the possibility of empirical knowledge, that's not my claim, right? They consider him, I think, to be a specific kind of skeptic, namely a skeptic about knowledge of a particular region of reality. Thus, even if it would be unfair to accuse Kant of holding that we cannot know empirical reality, it would not be unfair on their view to hold that Kant thinks there is an aspect of reality that we cannot know, namely the aspect in which things in themselves reside. And as I read the tradition, one way of resisting this reading of Kant is to turn to a so-called epistemological reading, wherein the distinction between appearances and things as they are in themselves is made only from within our epistemic conception of the genuine objects of knowledge, that is, appearances. But the first thing I want to suggest here is that this epistemic approach is no better off. In fact, I think we should reject any interpretation of Kant which claims to be either metaphysical or epistemological, where these kinds of readings are in some ways exclusive of one another, right? One either reads Kant as fundamentally doing some sort of metaphysics or fundamentally doing some sort of epistemology. And for one thing, even the epistemological reading, I think, does not entirely avoid a kind of skeptical interpretation of Kant, and therefore both readings in one way or the other hold that for Kant our ignorance of things in themselves leaves open certain questions about those things, as if there were really answers to be had. And secondly, I think Lucy Allais is right that transcendental idealism has both epistemic and metaphysical import. There is a sense in which what we have to say about our noumenal ignorance has real metaphysical significance in that it determines the boundaries of knowledge. We'll see more about this. And in determining those boundaries, it draws the boundaries of empirical reality in some sense for Kant. And this issue of metaphysical import, however, is often discussed as a way in which Kant holds that we can know something of things in themselves, either of their existence or something merely trivial about them, or formal and not substantive. And I want to reject that sort of metaphysical reading, according to which these are aspects of reality. We can describe something about them very trivially or formally only. So regarding, here's an example of the epistemological sort of reading, regarding the possibility of knowing our freedom in thinking and acting. Henry Allison has remarked, and this is quote number 3 on the handout, he says, Kant grants the epistemic possibility that we might not be genuinely spontaneous beings. What he denies is that we could ever be in a position, say as the result of scientific developments, to deny our spontaneity while still affirming our status as genuine cognizers and agents. In this respect, then, the notion of spontaneity is built into, indeed constitutive of, the first-person standpoint itself. And, as Kant continually points out, this is perfectly compatible with the possibility of fully naturalized accounts of both thinking and acting considered as event types in the phenomenal world. And for Allison, it seems built into his epistemic reading of Kant's transcendental idealism that a commitment to our own freedom is a mere standpoint, one that may be called into doubt if the right scientific evidence were encountered, although not from within the standpoint itself, since it is, as he says, constitutive of our judging and acting. This is a conception of the way in which our noumenal ignorance, so to speak, leaves open certain questions. On this view, it leaves them open in the sense that there either is or really possibly is an answer of which we're simply ignorant. I would also refer people to a classic article written by Wilfrid Sellars called "This I or He or It, the Thing Which Thinks," which is a quote from the First Critique, wherein Sellars also presents the idea of things in themselves as though our idea of them was this kind of empty logical placeholder for some facts of the matter that are merely beyond our grasp, right? And so he leaves open questions of a certain sort, such as the question whether the self is a substance or not, right? Is the soul a kind of substance? Well, he thinks Kant's answer is, well, that's a fact. The fact of the matter is just something we'll never know, right? And I want to resist this kind of reading. On my reading of Kant, an inability to know things in themselves on its own reveals nothing about metaphysical reality, just like what is false does not in and of itself tell us what is true. But neither does this inability leave open these metaphysical questions in the sense that the matter may simply lie beyond our capacity for comprehension. But this may be confusing, since Kant is quite clear that we do represent the logical possibility of the noumenon, the thing in itself. Kant's way of putting this is to say that we represent noumena problematically, that is, with the awareness that the concept contains no contradiction. In the First Critique, he adds some other conditions to this, though in the logic lectures, Kant sometimes speaks as though problematical judging is simply judging the non-contradictoriness of a concept. By representing the noumenon problematically, then, we do seem to, in some sense, leave open their possibility, right? Namely, in a logical sense. not only do we judge their logical possibility, but we necessarily, he thinks, represent noumena. So quote 4 and 5, for instance, on the handout, are representative of this. In quote 4, he says, "The concept of a noumenon, taken merely problematically, remains not only admissible, but even unavoidable as a concept setting limits to sensibility." Why we necessarily represent the noumenon has to do with the function of the pure categories of understanding. So you can see in quote 5, he says, "The categories extend further than sensible intuition, since they think objects in general without seeing to the particular manner of sensibility in which they might be given." Kant's view seems to be that we cannot help but to think beyond what is given to us in perception. The categories, pure concepts of the understanding through which we think the objects given to us in perception, are nevertheless ways of thinking an object in general. So even if we can only know the objects that are sensibly given to us, he goes on in this quote, "They do not thereby determine a greater sphere of objects, since one cannot assume that such objects can be given without presupposing that another kind of intuition than the sensible kind is possible, which, however, we are by no means justified in doing." And if you look at quote 6, he says, "In the end, we have no insight into the possibility of such noumena, and the domain outside of the sphere of appearances is empty for us. That is, we have an understanding that extends farther than sensibility problematically, but no intuition, indeed not even the concept of a possible intuition, through which objects outside of the field of sensibility could be given, and about which the understanding could be employed assertorically." Okay, that's a lot, but these brief selections suggest a couple of things. One, that in representing the noumenon by extending thought beyond sensible intuition, we do not thereby determine a sphere of objects beyond those corresponding to our sensibility. And two, that this extension of thought beyond sensible intuition is a problematic rather than an assertoric representation. Taken together, these 2 points tell us that the necessary representation of the noumenon is not an assertion of the possibility of such an object in some sense, right? But how could this be if Kant admits, as he surely does, that we represent noumena as logically possible? This is a question, I imagine, coming from someone of a certain kind of Anglophone analytic mind, right, who thinks conceivability entails even metaphysical possibility. This is a huge topic, one that I can't get into fully here, but Kant indeed remarks that the concept of a noumenon, as it is a problematic concept, contains no contradiction and is therefore logically consistent. But one thing to keep in mind is that what Kant calls the assertion of possibility is what he calls assertion here is beyond a problematic representation. And this is so even though all modality of judging contains assertion in some sense. This is a complicated issue, but in a basic and probably oversimplified way, we can just sort of look at Kant's progression, his idea of the progression of modality in the functions of judging. He thinks of the progression as moving from problematic judging, which is as for our purposes here is judging, holding together some concepts into a unity in thought, but without asserting anything of their real or metaphysical possibility. The assertoric modality of judging, however, is the mode in which we are prepared to assert or negate something within the sphere of real possibility. And then apodictic judging brings in necessity. So if assertion is downstream from problematic representation in some sense, then when does the assertion of possibility arise? Perhaps that depends on when the question of possibility arises. So if we consider the question of logical possibility, it seems whether or not something is merely logically possible is a question about mere thinking. And whether or not something is really possible or metaphysically possible is a question posed from within the act of judging. And I think this is true for Kant, that he says, this is not on the handout, but he remarks very briefly at the end of the Transcendental Aesthetic that in experience, no question is ever asked about the thing in itself. I take Kant to mean in part that no question about the thing in itself is ever asked from within knowledge. That is, from within the perspective of judgment that takes itself to be knowledge of appearances. This does not rule out the possibility, which Kant actually affirms, that our knowledge of appearances requires us to frame the idea of a noumenon. What it tells us is rather that our knowledge of appearance is not thereby established in relation to the idea of any real possibility of knowledge of things in themselves. The real possibility of something, according to Kant, I believe, and we can see this, I think, in quotes 7 and 8 on the handout, the real possibility of something is inseparable from the judgment of that real possibility. And you cannot judge real possibility from outside of the assertion of it. This makes the topic of real possibility internal to the perspective of knowledge or experience, broadly conceived as the objectively valid judgment of reality. So in quote 7, we see him saying, now what corresponds in empirical intuition to sensation is reality. That is, what we perceive in perception is reality, right? That's what affects us in sensibility. And then in quote 8, this is from the postulates. Kant lays out 3 postulates, 2 of which are as follows. 1, that which agrees with the formal conditions of experience, that is, with the conditions of intuition and of concepts, is possible, and that which is bound up with the material conditions of experience, that is, with sensation, is actual. Real or metaphysical possibility and actuality are topics for Kant, it seems, that are internal to the formal conditions of experience and the material conditions of experience. That is, they cannot be understood from outside of those conditions. Now, in addition to what Kant says about judging real possibility, he's clear that synthetic judgment has nothing to say of things in themselves. I could have included more passages about this, but again, consider the brief claim that experience never asks after the thing in itself. There's also something at B332 in the critique where he mentions this about synthetic judgment. Again, the point seems to be that the point of view of synthetic judgment, if we're permitted the term point of view here, does not encompass the possibility of such objects. From within judgments that are or purport to be knowledge of appearances, there is no judgment of the thing in itself. For Kant, as we see, logical possibility is the object of thinking, mere thinking, right? Real possibility is the object of knowledge. But interestingly, Kant also spells out how knowledge of our noumenal ignorance is a determination of the boundaries of knowledge itself. So while we may never ask for the thing in itself from within the conditions of experience, we may frame a conception of the thing in itself in a judgment of the boundaries of experiential knowledge. Okay, I'll try to say something more about what this means. This is now our topic kind of doubling back on itself, so things are getting a bit complicated. What is it to know our noumenal ignorance? That is, to know that we don't know noumena for Kant. This act of the understanding's own self-limitation, and Kant calls it the limitation from the understanding of the sensibility. So it's a kind of self-limitation. This act is not an insight into the real possibility of noumena, but it's not a rejection of such a possibility. But also it would seem it's not an affirmation of the mere logical possibility of noumena. And I think both points are worth emphasizing here. So first, a rejection of real possibility would be a form of insight into the possibility of noumena, and would therefore be in conflict with Kant's claim that we have no such insight. And second, an affirmation of mere logical possibility is not insight enough, as I see it, as it doesn't give us determinate knowledge of anything, and therefore no determinate knowledge of the boundaries of knowledge. And that is exactly what Kant thinks we do have, and we must have from a critique of pure reason. The project of a critique is to determine such boundaries. Therefore, it would seem that even when an assertion of the possibility of noumena is warranted, it lies somewhere between logical and real possibility. That is, knowledge of our noumenal ignorance is genuine knowledge, but the object, so to speak, of that knowledge, namely the boundary of knowledge itself, is of course neither within the realm of real possibility, nor in the realm of mere thought or mere logical possibility, since it is a boundary between these realms. And this may seem to only offer a further puzzle, and so no real insight into the noumenal ignorance thesis, but I think it's progress. Specifically, it is a starting point for thinking about how our noumenal ignorance somehow involves a determination of what we don't know that also cannot pretend to be an expansion of the field of real possibility, or an expansion of our cognition of this field of real possibility, right? Now, based on what we have laid out so far, we have, I think, the means for drawing a distinction between what Kant calls our noumenal ignorance and what we might call noumenal skepticism. The skeptical position implies, as I alluded to earlier, in its denial of our knowledge of things in themselves, it implies that there may be some way those things are beyond our capacity of comprehension. On my reading of Kant, however, we must reject this claim. In rejecting it, there may be some way that noumena are beyond our capacity of comprehension, we clearly do not per se reject that there may be things in themselves in some way that they are. But beyond this, it's important to point out that our ignorance of these things permits no stance one way or the other. Our noumenal ignorance lies precisely in the fact that we do not judge things in themselves, that they are not within the purview of synthetic judgment. What does this position look like, right? I've said something very cryptic. There is something between logical and real possibility, and I have to admit, I haven't worked this out yet. This is a brand new project, and I don't know exactly what to say about this. But let me take a stab at this. So, as a first approximation, we may consider it to be a radical kind of openness, that is, a consciousness of some logically possible form of knowledge and corresponding object, that is, the form of knowledge being that of the intuitive intellect and the object being the noumenon, but on its own without any real assertoric force. that's not going to be enough to satisfy us, I take it. But another way of characterizing noumenal ignorance is to say that it is not ignorance with respect to a kind of object. We do not, that is, posit the possibility of a thing or aspect of things in reality to which our capacities fail to reach. We may say then that our ignorance is without contrary, in the sense that it is not a kind of ignorance among other kinds, or an ignorance in relation to something. This opens up the possibility of seeing, I think, this is where the really grand sounding claims come in for me. So buckle up for that. It opens up the possibility of seeing, in some sense, the true Socratic nature of Kant's noumenal ignorance thesis, right? As it suggests an intrinsic lack in our knowledge, but a lack that is itself a condition of the possibility of the knowledge that we do have. And perhaps I'll need to say more about that. But in order to bring out the way in which our noumenal ignorance is itself determined in an act of knowing, that is, knowing that I do not know, in this Socratic fashion, we might focus more exactly on what the object of our knowledge, our ignorance, is. And Kant hints at what sort of quote-unquote object this is in a passage from the Phenomena in Noumena chapter of the First Critique. So this is quote number 9, where he says, apologies, it's a long quote, so read along with me. He says, thinking in itself, to be sure, is not a product of the senses, and to this extent is also not limited by them. But it is not on that account immediately of any independent and pure use, without assistance from sensibility, for it is in that case without an object. And one cannot call the noumenon such an object, for this signifies precisely the problematic concept of an object for an entirely different intuition and an entirely different understanding than our own, which is thus a problem itself. The concept of the noumenon is therefore not the concept of an object, but rather the problem unavoidably connected with the limitation of our sensibility of whether there may not be objects entirely exempt from the intuition of our sensibility, a question that can only be given the indeterminate answer that since sensible intuition does not pertain to all things without distinction, room remains for more and other objects. They cannot therefore be absolutely denied, but in the absence of a determinate concept, for which no category is serviceable, they also cannot be asserted as objects for our understanding. The understanding accordingly bounds sensibility without thereby expanding its own field. The concept of the noumenon, Kant says, is not the concept of an object, but rather the very problem of whether there are such objects, right? As it's not a concept of an object, it is in some sense an empty concept, I think. In the immediately following chapter, in the Amphiboly, Kant goes so far as to say that the concept of the noumenon is a concept of a kind of nothing. This is Kant's way of saying that it is a concept to which no intuition corresponds. That is, it is empty or nothing for us. As an empty concept, it has no matter, or in this sense, it lacks a material object. But as the concept of the noumenon is put to use in the understanding's determination of its own boundaries, and so in a determining judgment, this concept is not nothing at all, or absolutely nothing. It must be, as the mark of our ignorance, a consciousness of what my knowledge as finite lacks. It is therefore a form of self-consciousness. This means that the concept of the noumenon is put to use in a judgment about our knowledge, and thus represents an emptiness or a lack within us. Right? So the nothingness here is not the nothingness, as Heidegger says, of the nihil originarium, or original nothingness. And I should mention, although in another sense, The concept of the noumenon represents absolute plenitude or fullness, as it represents the object of an intuitive intellect, right? So the object of God's knowledge is not nothing, it's everything. So navigating these distinctions is difficult, but perhaps one thing that will help is to bring back into view the distinction between the noumenon as it is conceived negatively and as it is conceived positively. Even though we can and must think both, Kant also says that the concept of a noumenon is only of negative use. Perhaps the implication here is that while we must think even the positive noumenon, the concept of noumena which has any application for the use of the understanding is the negative one, which is the concept corresponding to our lack or emptiness. Now, this way of understanding what the emptiness of the concept is will help us to see that it's not nonsense of which Kant speaks, this emptiness. As some have feared, I think Strawson and McDowell, for instance, have feared that for Kant, this concept is really just unintelligible. For it's an emptiness, the reason why it's not this sort of nonsense, I think, is that it's an emptiness that is grasped, and it's grasped in ourselves. It's a kind of self-consciousness. And so it's not the emptiness of, say, a tautology or an obvious fact, right? It's different. So here are a few, just to wrap up, a few of the implications of what I've said. Kant's noumenal ignorance thesis does not, I think, place knowledge of appearances alongside the possibility of, and therefore doesn't reveal it to be relative to, the possibility of noumenal knowledge. This means that our knowledge of appearances, knowledge of the empirical world, is knowledge of reality, full stop, not an aspect of reality. To suggest that it is knowledge of only an aspect of reality is to assume a realm of real possibility beyond which we're capable of comprehending knowledge. And this is strictly denied, it seems, by Kant. And because our noumenal ignorance is without contrary in this sense, it may not be used to compare our own knowledge of appearances unfavorably, for instance, with God's knowledge, right? That is, we may not use the positive concept of an intuitive intellect as a determinate kind of knowing against which we place our own determinate kind of knowing, thereby, say, relativizing our knowledge to our own kind of faculty or principle for knowing. But all of this does not, I think, undermine the idea that we conceive our knowledge of appearances as lacking in some way. Importantly for Kant, while we know appearances, that is, we know reality, full stop, we know them from within our grasp of a certain problem. Returning to the thought that the object, so to speak, of the knowledge of our noumenal ignorance is the problem of whether such objects exist. It may be useful to think of this problem in terms of a task given to us by reason. Kant's insistence that the concept of a noumenon is a problematic concept already suggests, given his remarks early on in the critique about the progression of logical modalities, that it is held in the mind as something potentially asserted or negated. And returning to the thought that all modalities of judging contain a basic kind of assertion, we can see that even problematic judging is holding concepts together as a unity in the mind, but without ascending to the level of real possibility. Thus, the necessary representation of the noumenon for our knowledge is the necessary thought of a certain, not bare potentiality, but the potentiality of reasons obtaining self-sufficiency and completion. As it is this consciousness of potentiality which bounds our knowledge, it is also in some sense this potentiality which provides the frame within which knowledge of reality can progress from problematic judging to assertoric to apodictic. Perhaps it is in grasping this problem at the heart of our knowledge that we come to see reason's task of completion as given to us. In one sense of reason giving us a task. We'll see in the second critique and further that reason gives us a task in perhaps an even more complete way, in a practical way. As Kant says in the critique's introduction, the real problem of pure reason is how are synthetic judgments a priori possible? This is a way of saying that pure reason's problems are its tasks. If this is right, then in a sense what we are seeing is the theoretical side of what functions in Kant's practical philosophy as hope, a commitment to the infinite task of self-realization, which may not ever be fulfilled in time. Okay, so I will stop there. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Addison, for this wonderful talk. And now we have some time for questions. If you have a question, you can raise the blue hand, or you can write it in the chat. Yes, Axel.
First of all, thank you. I really, really, really liked your talk. I'm not a Kantian, and still you made it like very, very engaging and made me a lot to think about. So so my question comes from there, right? And it is because I was puzzled about how you deal with what is problematic in Kant, because even in the last or the second to last quote you presented from Kant, I think it's very clear that what Kant means by problematic is that a concept is problematic if you can only use it to raise questions that you cannot answer, right? And you always insisted, what sort of assertions we can do with this concept. And I think what Kant is telling us is that, no, these are concepts that you cannot adequately use in assertions. Their only role in cognition is to raise questions, furthermore, questions that you cannot answer. So yes, they are a priori in the sense that they come from a pure understanding, but that doesn't mean that pure understanding can also give us actual positive thoughts about them. It can only give us questions. I think that is why it's always, I don't remember the quote, I can go and look for it, but he goes like, it's about whether, right? It is not about if or things like that, just whether these things are possible. So once we grasp the concept of things a priori, we cannot escape making the question of whether they are possible. And that is the kind of thoughts we can have, which are not actual assertions, but they are questions. Am I wrong? And doesn't this solve then the apparent paradox?
Thank you for that. Yeah, that's really interesting. I think part of the problem, and part of the problem going forward in my attempt to figure out what Kant's talking about here, is that it's a bit difficult to determine what problematic judging is exactly, as you pointed out, right? And it can be a little mysterious, and so there are many distinctions to pay attention to, right? There's problematic judging. He also talks about problematic concepts, right? Which that may not itself be an act of problematic judging. And we have to wonder whether the problematic concept is, in some sense, the product of problematic judging, or what role that plays with respect to judging, the activity of judging. That's one question. It's also difficult because as I briefly remarked in the talk. In the first critique, I think you're right that Kant talks as though problematic judging is this much stronger notion that involves a concept that we could never really vouch for, in a sense. So we could never have intuitions corresponding to. And so what's interesting, though, is that it seems in other places that Kant talks about problematic judging as though it's a modality of judgment that happens in quite ordinary cases. And so suspending, I don't know, you might think this is of course conjecture at this point on my part, but he does talk about having an opinion, for instance, as judging problematically. And it's not clear to me that that's going to be a case where we have in mind some concept that we can never vouch for, right? So now, is that Kant just being loose with his terminology and not being precise enough? Or is that, is there something else here going on with, did you have a follow-up to that, Axel?
Just that I think these are not two issues. This is the very same issue of what is the relation between problematic concept and problematic judgment. I was just trying to push you into keeping them apart because, yeah, problematic judgments are cheap. Problematic concepts are deep.
I see.
They are very borderline, so I don't know if deep is the right metaphor.
I like that that way of putting it, that problematic judgments are cheap, problematic concepts are deep. Can I steal that from you?
Oh, yes. No, I mean, this was me reacting to your talk. It was really, really great.
Thank you. No, that's really helpful. I think my main concern after having finished preparing this talk was how I'm going to go forward in thinking about what the relation is between problematic judging and problematic concepts. So I think you've helped push me further in that direction. Thanks.
Thank you, Efrain.
Okay, well, thank you, Addison, for a very good talk for this morning. I have a bunch of questions. I want to pose only two. The first one perhaps concerns your main argument for the ignorance without the country thesis, right? Because you seem to think that your thesis, your ignorance without the country, is with metaphysical or epistemical readings of ignorance. And I wonder if that's your view, and if so, then why? Because it seems to me that you can be a traditionalist as myself, I guess, and that ignorance is epistemic, some sort of epistemic humility in the line of Langton and Lucy Allais, and that what we're losing when we are epistemically humble, we just lose sight of certain kinds of properties of things. And so I wonder if you have an or maybe I didn't get it right.
Oh, is
yeah
Efrain,
maybe I got lost with the.
You got frozen for a second, yeah.
Sorry, I'm gonna stop my video. Maybe that helps. So the question is whether you think that your thesis, ignorance without the country, is incompatible with metaphysical readings of epistemic humility. And the other question is whether, because you seem to be concerned about whether ignorance, this sort of a robust radical ignorance, leaves out some questions, some important questions. And I wonder if those questions would be rather channeled through the practical interest of reason, not through the theoretical one, but through the practical interest of reason. So maybe there you have ignorance without the country in the practical domain. I don't know if this makes sense or the connection is right, but this is my... And thanks again for an excellent talk, Addison.
Oh, thank you, Efrain. That's a. I think I understand you correctly, but you can let me know if I'm missing the mark. So, with respect to your first question, I think I do want to say that ignorance without contrary is incompatible with both so-called metaphysical and epistemological approaches. And the thought was something like, according to the metaphysical approach, or on my view, according to both, really, there is, they want to include a kind of cognition of what's in the sphere of real possibility against which our ignorance seems to stand, right? And that would be like saying, and so that's not, of course, even to say there are things in themselves, but just we know that there really possibly are things in themselves, right? That's a way of cognizing something about or within the realm of real possibility against which we say, but we're ignorant, we can't know them. And I want to say that the ignorance without contrary thesis holds that we're ignorant, but not of any conception of these things as belonging to the field of real possibility. And so that, and it makes it without contrary, just I think in the sense that there is no determinate conception that stands over against, as it were, our conception of this kind of ignorance, right? So it's not like the case where I'm ignorant of the number of stars, but I know there's some answer to be had one way or the other. And I just, maybe I'm incapable of finding the answer, but it's there, right? And that would be a kind of ignorance with contrary. It would be like contrasting ignorance with learning something. And what I want to say here is that we don't even have, maybe a better way for me to put this point would be to say something like, in our noumenal ignorance for Kant, we don't even have a concept of what it would be to learn what we don't know. And so we expand our cognition in no way with respect to real possibility. That might, I'm not sure if that is helpful, but that at least it's helping me at least a little bit to think through this. So that's good. Your point about practical philosophy is also, I think, a really good point, because it is true, and I didn't say anything about this in the talk, well, except at the very end about hope, which I don't know if I have any business saying that about hope, but it seems to me to have something to do with it in some way. But I think you're right that there's a sense in which Kant, in the first critique, leaves the topic of noumena to be dealt with by practical philosophy. And so the answer, in some sense, will ultimately have to do with how does theoretical philosophy and practical philosophy, how do they unite, right? What is our conception of their cooperation? I think my view about the role of the noumenon in the first critique is something like, even though our theoretical ignorance has its own particular character, theoretical character, what it does is it sets us up to see that ultimately we don't even have this theoretical ignorance without a conception of its practical fulfillment in some way, right? That is that. So for those who don't work on Kant, and this might be sort of mysterious sounding, there's right the here we're thinking of the concepts of God and the soul and freedom becoming a kind of special case in the practical philosophy, because we do have knowledge of freedom, he thinks, even though we can only have faith in the immortality of the soul and of God's existence. But nevertheless, even though those are articles of faith in Kant's practical philosophy, they gain some kind of purchase in the practical case that they don't have in the theoretical case. And so the idea of our sort of progressing towards an understanding of them is maybe more determinate in the practical sphere than it is in the theoretical. So maybe another way of making my thoughts here precise would be to be clear about what the theoretical character of this ignorance is and the knowledge of our ignorance versus the practical character of that ignorance. That's a really, I think that even more difficult question probably. Yeah, thanks.
Okay, thank you, Addison. And now Edgar, please.
Yeah, hello, Addison. I really liked your talk. I think it's very interesting, and it made me think about a lot of things. And one of these, I mean, is related to something that you said about Aristotle, and it relates also to a discussion that Axel and I have been having on the topic of whether knowledge has an opposite or not, in relation to a paper we're working on, the puzzle of false judgment in the Theaetetus. Okay, so you say that Aristotle thinks that knowledge doesn't have an opposite or something like that, right? But I think, there's evidence that he thinks that it has, because, there is, let me see, sorry. Yes, in the Anima, around, let me see, 427b, from B8 to B26, he talks twice about the opposite of knowledge and the opposite of true doxa or true judgment. He thinks that they are different. That the opposite of knowledge is one thing and the opposite of true judgment is a different thing, right? So the opposite of true judgment is just false judgment, because judgment deals with contingent matters of fact, while knowledge deals with necessary matters of fact. So they have different opposites. He doesn't say what is the opposite of knowledge, but he does think that he has it has an opposite. So that was just one point about Aristotle, and I think a similar idea is required by Plato to deal with the puzzle of false judgment, which is simply the idea that, in Axel's and my own interpretation, we think that the puzzle derives from the idea that opposites cannot cause or ground opposites. So if we accept, if we assume that we know the objects involved, then we cannot simply judge falsely about them, because our knowledge, in a way, cannot cause ignorance, which for Plato, at least in that puzzle, is false judgment, right? And so that was one point. That for Plato and Aristotle, the opposite of ignorance seems to be knowledge. But you suggested also that the opposite of was something like learning, right? And that's interesting. Also, and in the puzzle of false judgment, Socrates says that learning is learning and forgetting are between knowledge and ignorance, which are the opposites. So something like that. If you want, we can talk later about that idea, because I think there's an interesting parallel between Plato, Aristotle, and Kant, because there is the idea that in Plato, at least, that concerning empirical matters, there are opposites. The opposites is true judgment and false judgment. But concerning a priori thought, the opposites are different. They are not the same. But of course, he's not. But if you assume something like the Kantian position, it seems natural to think that if there is really not knowledge of, at this a priori level, and only ignorance, that ignorance cannot be, let's say, opposed to something that have to do with knowledge, right? So I mean, I think it's an interesting idea.
Yeah, thank you. That gives me a lot to think about here. And I think actually, yeah, you're bringing in a really good point about Aristotle, and I think, yeah, I think what you're bringing out here maybe is that the issue is far more complicated than what I'm presenting here. So if the question is, does Aristotle think knowledge has a contrary, or are we permitted such an idea? Maybe the issue is just a bit more complicated, and the answer is, well, we clearly have we clearly know that there is something like not knowing, right, which is opposed to knowing, and so there's a contrary in that sense, but here I don't know. I'm thinking that maybe to be clear, what I could say is that there is a pair of contraries, learning, or ignorance and knowledge gained by learning, right? Something like that. But there's a kind of knowledge that doesn't have a contrast with ignorance. And maybe this is pure knowledge, knowledge as a pure activity. This becomes a really difficult issue about Aristotle, about whether we are to understand the activity of energia as applying to all forms of knowledge, or if he's going to say that it belongs to pure knowledge but not something else like empirical knowledge, right? I don't know. This is a bit beyond me, so I shouldn't remark on that. But yeah, I think you're right that my interpretation of this is that of your question is that it's an opportunity to be a bit clearer about what it is to have a contrary, exactly, precisely because we have a determinate conception of what knowledge is, and so we also know in some sense that not knowing is something we can set over against next to knowledge, right? But I think one other thing to say here is that for Kant, at least, we don't have a determinate conception, perhaps, of what it is to simply lack knowledge, right? Simplicator. That's not really like a determinate concept that we have. And so there may be a kind of awareness that we have of just lack, or of just lacking knowledge or something, but we don't have a determinate concept of what that is. Maybe that's another way in which I could try to explain that knowledge has no contrary. I'm not sure. What do you think about that?
Yeah, I mean, you're right that we have to get clear on what being a contrary or opposite is, and also contrast this with the contradictory of knowledge, right? Because not knowing seems to be like the contradictory of knowledge, in some sense, right? So not neither. I mean, the contrary or the opposite, as whatever you call it. But I think that what you say seems to be right. I think. Yes.
Okay. Now, Santiago, please.
Thank you very much for your excellent talk. I have a very general question about what it means to problematically judge. And I was wondering whether there is a difference on your view between that mental act and suspending judgment. There is a difference whether you would still borrow Axel's idea that problematically judging is cheap.
Yeah, thank you. This is a really good question. I was considering this before. The extent to which we could associate problematic judging with suspension of judgment. Okay, so here's a first pass at answering you, and probably not satisfactory, so we'll see. But it seems to me that at the very least, problematic judging contains a kind of suspension, right? And so it involves suspending in the sense that I'm conscious of holding these representations together, but in a way that I'm not prepared to assert or deny anything of them, of their union. And so it is suspension in that sense. Okay, so far, does that seem right? And what does that kill everything that I've said?
It doesn't kill. It doesn't kill anything. I'm just trying to have a better picture of what your view is. So it seems to me that suspension can be assessed for rationality, for instance. So, and one might even claim that there are considerations that speak in favor of suspension or not. And that might make more demanding the attitude of problematically judging. So one might want to know what in Kant's thought the considerations would be that lead to this suspension. So that's why I wanted to know a little bit more. Yeah.
I see. Thanks. Yeah. Yeah. So I think what I want to say is that the suspension of judgment is an activity that covers a variety of cases that are even outside of problematic judging, and that problematic judging is a special case of suspension, something like that. Yeah.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Santiago and Addison. And Clinton, please.
Hello, Addison. I'll keep my video also on off. Like Ephraim, my connection is never so good, so apologies to not get to see you, or let you see me. Actually, it's probably better you don't see me. But anyways, yes, Addison, thanks for the talk. So I want to follow up on the questions from Axel and Santiago about the rationality of the ideas. And let me try also on Ephraim's point that you haven't really addressed some of the deeper motivations for the metaphysical readings. So if you combine the naming of reason and rationality over and against the understanding with the possibility of a kind of relationship, not just to the concept, but to the object, I think what you would get is something like all of the pages that happen after the Phenomena Noumena chapter, which is the dialectic, the prolegomena. I mean, there's so much else that's about exactly the objects, which are noumena. And so it seems strange that the full doctrine of the noumenon would be articulated and closed as to its significance in relation to rationality more generally and reason in particular, before reason is even introduced in the book. And there's another hundreds and hundreds of pages. And the conclusions by page 700s or 800s do not at all seem to be that there is no object. There's a reaffirmation of a limitation of a kind of cognition that we can have through the understanding, of course. But it seems like both, not only can we entertain the concept problematically, but especially by the sections on the final aim of the dialectic, the conclusion seems to be we have entitlement to assume that these objects are there. And so the technical term is annehmen. And there it seems totally metaphysical. It's that we assume that these objects are there. Of course, we don't cognize how they are in themselves, but that doesn't speak at all about their standing, their existence, in relation to all of the things that we're reasoning about. And the prolegomena that's even more straightforwardly affirmed in the end of part 3, which is the corresponding part to the dialectic, Kant says even more dramatically that there is a cognition actually left for reason. And it's a cognition by analogy, and it's positive, and it's a cognition of these things, not as they are in themselves, but in relation to the cognitions of the understanding. And so I did find it a little bit disappointing that the account didn't extend to the doctrine of reason at all. And so it seems totally right, everything that you said, that from the point of view of the understanding and the cognition according to the understanding, there would be a kind of emptiness in relation to this, the object and the concept in relation to the object, because there's no intuition. But this is only page, whatever, 300, and there's 500 more pages about reason, which has its own kind of, at least the possibility of cognition, which wouldn't be through intuition, but out of principles. And that just seems like a new topic. And so we turn the page and then we ask all these new questions about objects, which out of ex hypothesis are not given an intuition, but yet still we're asking, could we cognize them? Now, if the answer is, well, you can't cognize anything, you can't be given an intuition, the dialectic would be very short. It's like, well, we just ended the cognitions of the understanding. There's no cognitions left for reason, but it's very long. And it seems like the conclusion is not absolutely negative or empty, but we can assume, we have entitlement to assume, and there's a thing. And just to pick up more explicitly on the point about the practical, I just wonder how it seems like the very same concept is thought problematically. The object of that concept is assumed and posited in this, whatever the use of reason is at the end of the dialectic. And then it's that same object which is affirmed, the proposition, and it's a theoretical proposition which is held to be true on the basis of practical grounds about that same object. If the identity of the object holds across the problematic entertaining, the assuming, and the holding true of the theoretical proposition that involves it for practical grounds, it seems very hard to say that there's no object there, there's no thing missing that we then fill out. I mean, the whole language in the practical philosophy is exactly, we're realizing and filling out something, which makes it seem like there was a lack. And so the idea that there would be no contrary. So I know it's a lot. I was trying to stitch a bunch of things together on the basis of some of the previous comments, but really it's a plea to try to get you to say something about reason, something about these positive relationships to the very same objects in relation to holding true, in relation to assuming. I don't know if you have thoughts about that. Thanks.
Yeah, thanks, Clinton. That's I think you're absolutely right that you know, a more thorough examination of this topic needs to venture past this territory and into the dialectic, and even past the dialectic, right, and into what Kant says in the at the very end of the critique and in the practical philosophy. But that said, I don't know if I'll have much in the way of a satisfying answer for you now, but what I want to say is that this point I was making about there being something between logical and real possibility that we seem to be grasping in our knowledge of knowledge's boundaries, I think could be, at least it could be a way of understanding various claims that Kant makes that make him sound as though he's really committed to, you know, the existence of things in themselves, something like this, right? And I don't mean to dispute that there may be passages in which he clearly right asserts such a possibility. Of course, you know, we can talk about the historical Kant and the phases of Kant and Kant's writings, or we can talk about this idea that we might have of like what the mature Kant really thought, right, in his deepest of hearts or something. And I think I'm talking about something like that, talking about what is Kant's view sort of from this the most mature perspective. And it seems to me that in many cases, at least, although we'd have to look at individual quotations, for instance, when Kant says that, like, I take it you have some, I mean, you may have other examples in mind, but I think you have in mind examples that are common to when the case where Kant says that the concept of appearance brings with it the concept of that which appears. So Kant often says this, that like when we say we know appearances, we also affirm in some sense that there's something that must appear. And this just causes all kinds of problems because there are different interpretations of course, what it means for something to be an appearance and appearing, and the relation between this appearing and the object that appears. And there's a difference in view about whether Kant had an early position on this that he then later, took back. But I think one way of understanding such a claim ordinarily might just be that we frame this conception of I'll try to put this, I'm not sure I have the right words yet, but in grasping what it is for something to appear, we also necessarily grasp what it is for something to be that which appears, or but that doesn't commit us to saying anything about the real possibility of that which appears, or the thing in itself, if that's what we're talking about. It seems like on my account, we can still say this is the job of this sort of position between logical and real possibility, right? It's not mere logical possibility. It's not an assertion of any kind of real possibility, but it's something like a cognition of a problem, yet something that we don't have enough of a determinate grasp of to assert anything positive about, right? And it seems to me that we can interpret lots of passages in Kant this way that are often read as in a sort of metaphysical fashion, although we'd have to go through these particular passages. And so I'm afraid that what I'm saying here is not going to be very convincing. But so that's one thing I wanted to say. I mean, another thing I wanted to say is I think your question about the role of practical philosophy, so kind of jumping on Ephraim's question and asking about, as you put it, the identity of the object from across theoretical reason and practical reason, right? And as you note, Kant says that even in the matter of cognizing in some sense these noumena practically, we have some kind of attitude towards a theoretical proposition. And so we affirm a theoretical proposition on practical grounds. And so we have that same object that we had in theoretical reason, but now it's in practical reason. And now we have a different relation to it such that we can say we have some kind of cognition. And so one attempt, I take it, the strategy here is then to say, well, we can read back to the first critique now, this idea that we have a kind of knowledge, practical knowledge of these things, which then permits Kant to say all kinds of things about their real possibility. But I'm not sure about this, and again, I hate to say that I probably don't have a satisfying answer at this point, but I suspect that in practical reason, even though practical reason is borrowing a theoretical proposition for its purposes, it's schematizing that proposition in a different way, so to speak, or it's a so for instance, if we think about the article of faith in God's existence, right? Kant says this is a theoretical proposition that God exists, and we come to affirm it when we don't know it, but we affirm it in practical philosophy. But I wonder whether existence in that case is being understood in a different way. That is, it's being borrowed from theoretical philosophy, the proposition, but is it being schematized, or is it being put to use in the same way? Does existence mean the same thing exactly as it does in the theoretical case, right? That's a question I think, I'm not sure what the answer is, but I suspect that for Kant, it's going to be something different. And that's kind of difficult to figure out from the second critique, but that would be a preliminary response to that part of what you were saying. Sorry, I'll think more about this though, and we'll talk more about it once because these are really difficult questions.
Thanks.
Thank you. Martin, please.
Yes, thank you very much. I was wondering, in relation to what you said knowledge of appearances is knowledge of reality, full stop, right? More or less. And I was wondering what the relation of that, or how it's related with your main claim. Well, let's say what's the relation with transcendental idealism? I mean, one worry about Kant's philosophy is that he says reality isn't quite real. It's always ideal, and we don't get to what's metaphysically real, right? Which is precisely things in themselves. And so, are you saying that? I don't know. Is one consequence of your view that maybe we shouldn't talk about transcendental idealism at all? That it's not really a form of idealism.
Thanks. I think what I want to say about that is that I mean, I think I read Kant differently here, and so I don't read him as holding that metaphysical, or let's just call it reality, right? Empirical reality is never quite. I mean, one way you might say it's never quite real if you stipulate, right, that the conception of the real here is the conception of the transcendental realist, the one who thinks that reality can be known, for instance, independently of our forms of sensibility. And I read Kant as holding that idea doesn't really gain it doesn't really make sense. I mean, it's not incoherent. I mean, it's logically thinkable, but it's actually not a real possibility. And so for Kant, empirical reality is always bound up with the ideal, and in that sense, reality is always bound up with the ideal. And then there's just no way of getting out of that relation between the real and the ideal for Kant, except in this kind of problematic conception, right, of the sort of intellect that is self-sufficient and complete in itself, like God's intellect, right? And so we have a problematic thought of such a thing, but we don't have a determinate conception. That is, we don't have an ability to say one way or the other sort of what the real possibility of this conception of the real could be, right? So that maybe that's maybe that's a helpful way of putting it. That our conception of real possibility already includes, right, the sense in which reality here in real possibility is bound up with our conditions of judging it. And so reality never really means anything other than that which is already ideal in some sense for Kant.
Okay, thank you, Martin and Addison. And Pedro, please.
So thank you very much, Addison. There are many interesting things here, but I really didn't understand which is your proposal concerning what it is, things in itself, a thing in itself. I understood that you distinguish between empirical ignorance, I mean, an ignorance of something that we could know, but we actually don't, and something that we could call transcendental ignorance. And I ask you, your proposal is that transcendental ignorance is ignorance without contrary. So you say it makes no sense to say that we know things in themselves. But I was trying to understand what does that really mean. And an example, freedom, which is a problematic concept, this heavy concept of Axel, freedom. It makes sense to say that we know that we are freedom. I think that you are committed to say it makes no sense to say that we know we are free. Would you agree with that?
Not quite, only because and this is kind of going back to something Clinton said. I mean, freedom is the sort of thing for Kant that he does think we clearly have practical knowledge of. And so we don't have theoretical knowledge of freedom. So the question could be, do I want to say, does it make sense? It doesn't make sense to think that we know theoretically that we're free.
Right.
I depends on what it means to make sense. I think that it makes logical sense. It's thinkable that we're free. So it's not nonsense. In other words, it's not a worry about that, right? But it doesn't make sense in the sense that right, our knowledge is not something that could take a point of view on this. Yeah.
Okay.
All right. Well, thank you very much, Addison. I don't see any more blue hands, so I think we can stop here. And well, thanks to everyone for being here, and see you next time. Muchas gracias por estar aquí y nos vemos.
Thank you, everyone.
La próxima.